Hello, followers. How can a traditional American family make police headlines? What good was the dynasty surrounding this family and the infinite wealth they possessed? This story, followers, is about the most influential and powerful surname in South Carolina for over a century. A family identified by their law practice throughout the ages. A family surrounded by mysteries involving various events that culminated in the loss of life of several people. People who somehow knew, worked with, lived alongside, or were even members of the Murdaugh family themselves. Followers, we're going to start by talking about Alex Murdaugh. He was the heir to a traditional and successful law firm in South Carolina in the United States, and honored his family's name by being considered one of the most influential lawyers in the region where he practiced. He actively participated in jury trials as a representative of the law. However, followers, in 2003, Alex Murdaugh saw the other side of the coin, because that year, it was he who sat in the defendant's seat. But how did this happen all of a sudden? An all-powerful lawyer being accused of a crime. That, followers, is what I'm going to tell you about from now on. As it couldn't be otherwise, this story begins in the lowlands of South Carolina in a region known as the Low Country. That's where the famous Sea Islands are located, and there are also many waterways, also known as little roads on the water, bathed by the Atlantic Ocean. The region is surrounded by salt marshes and small lagoons, and the most appropriate mode of transportation for the coastal regions of that location are boats. However, followers, I'm not talking about just any canoe or fishing boat, and only the wealthy can obtain enough money to get a boat like this. To make this type of journey in that region, the most appropriate vehicles are motorized watercraft, which generally cost more than a luxury car. Now we're going to start talking about the Murdaugh family, who lived precisely in this region I mentioned here. This is a dynasty of lawyers who, as a rule, dominated the legal context of the Low Country. That's right, followers, the Murdaugh family had this motorized watercraft I was referring to here. And remember this information well, because this Murdaugh boat will be the scene of a true tragedy that I'll report later. And always keep in mind that we're talking about one of the most powerful families in that region, both for their financial condition and their influence as well.
The fact, followers, is that the Murdaugh surname carried weight for over a century in South Carolina, and the main references that identified this family in that region were always law and order. However, they're mistaken, those who think they were a reference of ethics too. Far from it, the Murdaughs also had a rotten and obscure side that weighed on the family. But how did the century-old history of the Murdaugh family begin? That, followers, is what I'm going to start explaining from now on. This family dynasty, followers, begins with Randolph Murdaugh Sr., born at the end of the 19th century, more precisely in the year 1887, and passes through 2 generations before reaching Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Alex, our central character in this story, born in the year 1968. The fact, followers, is that everything indicated that legal sciences were intrinsic in the veins of the Murdaugh family, meaning becoming a lawyer was something rigid in that family. What I mean by this is that apparently a Murdaugh never had a choice. Their destiny was traced even when they were still a baby in their mother's womb, because in this family's mind, anything goes. The only thing that didn't go was ending the good name of the Murdaughs, closing a law firm with over a century of operation and prestige. Alex married Maggie, a woman 10 years younger than him. Together they had 2 sons. The oldest, who was named Richard, better known as Buster, born in 1996, and the youngest, the problematic Paul, born in 1999. While Buster was centered and wanted to continue his father's profession and business by attending law school, Paul kept himself completely distant from this intent. For better clarification and understanding of the facts, followers, Alex visibly had a special affection for his oldest son, Buster. He was the son who didn't give him troubles, wanted to be a lawyer to continue the family business, and was more in accordance with the purposes his father had reserved for him and his brother. And for this reason, followers, he was considered Alex's favorite son. Paul, unlike his brother, was completely uninterested in the family business. He drank uncontrollably, and because of this, created serious and sometimes even irreversible problems involving the Murdaugh name. And for this reason, followers, Paul was considered the black sheep of the family. Buster and Paul became teenagers and went to study at the most prestigious school in South Carolina, the Wade Hampton High School. And everything indicated that due to the Murdaugh surname, they would become popular with their classmates, considering that stereotypical cliché of North American educational institutions of the athlete student and the most popular in school. However, this didn't happen with them because something was wrong with them at this school. Something that prevented popularity for Buster and Paul, because there was a thorn in the Murdaugh family's side at this school. A classmate of Paul and Buster named Stephen Smith. Stephen was Paul's classmate. He was the only openly gay person in the Low Country. Now imagine, followers, the Low Country is a small and very conservative town. Stephen was Paul's classmate, and what comes to my mind when I say this, Paul was part of one of the most well-regarded and hypocritical families in South Carolina. He was an extremely maladjusted boy, and there's even more to come. Attending Stephen's classroom, Paul had this perception of the boy's sexual orientation. But all this is speculation, and I'm only going to talk about what happened with Paul in the year 2015. In 2015, Stephen was 19 years old and had a problem with his car on a road located in a deserted and dark place at night. At that moment, his car had a flat tire and ran out of gas. Sometime later, 911 was called. It was a driver who saw someone lying on the ground on the road and got worried and didn't approach much to know who it was. And besides, there was a risk of someone running over this person. The police arrive at the location indicated by the driver, and there it's confirmed that the person is lifeless and that it was Stephen Smith. The body was found a few meters from the shoulder where his car was, and it was also noticeable that there was severe head trauma on the victim.
The Low Country was shocked and stunned by the death of a boy with so much life ahead like Stephen. The inhabitants of that small town immediately wanted answers about what happened to him. On one thing, everyone agreed. It was a hate crime. But those people wanted more. They wanted to know who took that boy's life. Well, followers, some must be wondering what the Murdaugh's relationship is with this crime. I know I've already commented here about Paul's conduct, about the conservatism of the town and the problems Stephen faced, and everything else. And it was from some rumors at school that Stephen became a thorn in the Murdaugh family's side. Because among the rumors that arose at school, there were comments about an intimate relationship between Stephen and Buster, Alex's oldest son, who at the time was showing signs of his true sexual orientation and showing himself willing to assume a relationship with Stephen when everything happened. There was a version that Stephen called Buster when his car broke down asking for help, and Buster was with some friends at his house when he received this call. When Buster was questioned by his friends, he made up an excuse and left, but Buster's friends followed him, and when they arrived at Stephen's car, the boy was brutally beaten and his body positioned in the middle of the road precisely so he would be accidentally run over, and with that he would have that head trauma. Well, followers, the town was very interested in the investigation of the facts about what happened to Stephen. But everything changed the moment Buster Murdaugh began to appear in the crime scene. People started walking on eggshells when the subject was this. Interest in the case began to decrease more and more, until it reached a point where the investigations closed for good, because the Murdaugh family had enough money to buy the silence of an entire town, and the ethics of local authorities too. And when Stephen's case was definitely finished, another crime involving the Murdaugh family happened, and that's what I'm going to tell you about from now on. 3 years after Stephen's case, in 2018, something inexplicable occurred with Gloria Satterfield,
the Murdaugh family's housekeeper for an estimated period of 15 years. Many believe that it was really she who raised Paul, considering that Gloria arrived to work at the Murdaugh house when Paul was still a 2- or 3-year-old child. Gloria and Paul had a very strong bond, as both were confidants and very good friends with each other. The fact, followers, is that Gloria was more present in Paul's life than his own mother. And moreover, followers, Alex and Maggie's favorite son was always Buster and never Paul, which explained the fact that Paul was so attached to Gloria. One morning, Gloria arrived at the Murdaugh mansion for another day of work. She greeted the other employees of the house and started her routine with breakfast. Soon after, she's found by Maggie Murdaugh fallen on the main staircase of the house with a lot of human blood around her. According to what Maggie alleged to another house employee, Gloria tripped over the dogs at the moment she was at the top of the stairs and with her back to the floor, because Gloria fell backwards just once, considering that her feet were on the upper steps of the stairs and her head toward the lower ones.
Gloria was taken to the hospital by a rescue team, where she stayed hospitalized for a few days. Shortly after, she loses her life at 57 years old. And the member of the Murdaugh family who felt this loss the most was Paul. In a legal maneuver, Alex decided to sue himself to get the insurance and pay compensation to Gloria's biological sons, who never received a single cent of this compensation for this accident. And followers, let's agree that this initiative of Alex's in itself is something completely absurd in the universe of jurisdiction anywhere in the world. In my opinion, it simply doesn't exist. And I don't know, followers, this idea of Alex's smelled to me like something similar to what we call money laundering here in Brazil. The fact, followers, is that according to the Netflix documentary, Alex hid questionable substances at home. And Paul knew this, knew his father had a problem with these substances, and Gloria discovered this and commented to Paul. This comment happened at the beginning of January 2018, and the fall that resulted in Gloria's sad end occurred on February 2nd, that is, less than 30 days later. What happened with Gloria intensified even more the drinking addiction Paul had, and the consequences that came after, followers, I'm going to tell you about from now on. Followers, do you remember at the beginning of this video that I said the Murdaughs owned a luxury boat? Well, this boat was used by Paul, and it was precisely this mixture of the boat being steered by Paul that resulted in the beginning of the Murdaugh family's disgrace. Paul invited some friends to go to an oyster roast, a very traditional event in South Carolina's winter, and logically, to facilitate transportation, they went in the Murdaugh family's boat, and it was Paul who drove. And at night, everything went well, but the problem, followers, was on the way back. Before making this narrative, followers, I'm going to include some more important characters in this story, who are Paul's friends and his girlfriend. His friends were Anthony and Connor Cook, who were cousins, and their girlfriends Morgan, who was dating Paul, Mallory, who was dating Anthony, and Miley, who was dating Connor. The friends had brought a cooler of drinks to warm themselves up, and when they arrived at the location, they drank even more, and made some posts on social media. And the group even thought about the possibility of returning home in a safer way, considering that Paul was highly intoxicated. However, Paul didn't agree with this idea, followers. Paul didn't want to convince himself that he was that drunk, and truly believed he could bring the group home safely. So everyone returned to the boat, and Paul was driving once more on the way back. And they still stopped at a dock on their return to buy more drinks, and were seen together for the last time by the security cameras at this dock. Connor knew how to steer boats just as well as Paul, and was much more sober than Paul too. Connor appealed several times to his friend's common sense, but it was no use. Paul was determined to put the lives of everyone who was there in danger. It got to the point of having abusive behavior with Morgan, his girlfriend, who also agreed with Connor to steer the boat. Paul physically assaulted his girlfriend and started cursing at her in a way that made friends realize that this wasn't the first time that was happening. At some point in the journey, Paul starts spinning the boat in the middle of the river, causing despair in his friends, who ask him to stop. But Paul seemed to be enjoying all of that and didn't stop. And faced with this irresponsibility, followers, the boat hit the beam of a bridge, injuring himself, Connor, Miley, and Morgan. But what about Anthony and Mallory?
What happened to them? This couple of sweethearts fell into the water, followers, and Anthony managed to return to the surface even though injured, but Mallory didn't.
The friends and Paul's girlfriend call 911 asking for help. Paul does differently. He makes a call to his family asking for help, and the Murdaugh family arrives at the scene of the facts together with the rescue team. Those involved are filmed in a deserted location, screaming for Mallory, and Paul is filmed starting to laugh, not realizing the dimension of the seriousness of his actions. Following this, the injured are taken to the hospital, and there Alex and his father, also lawyer Randolph Murdaugh, begin a manipulation of the fact, because they create a scenario where Connor would be guilty of everything, and he's the one who would be piloting the boat. Followers, I'm not sure if this was done through bribery of those involved or coercion. In my research, this wasn't very clear. What I know is that it would be much more interesting for the Murdaughs to accuse a stranger like Connor of having done this than someone from the family itself like Paul. As we already know, Connor had no fault in what happened. Paul had all the fault. Well, followers, in that context there, Connor was seriously injured, so much so that he couldn't give his version of the facts. He had a deep cut on his chin and his jaw was dislocated. However, as we already know, justice is blind but sees in the dark. The experts showed that it would be impossible for Connor to be driving the boat, since the injury he sustained could only occur if you were sitting at another point of the vessel, far from the location where the boat was steered. But everything was happening wrongly. Mallory continued missing and the others freaking out with the events. And logically, a corrupt police force enters into an agreement with the Murdaughs, claiming that Connor was indeed the boat's driver. There's a reason there's nothing so bad that it can't get worse, right, followers? In this case, the negligence of the American police was glaring. They didn't notify Mallory's family about her disappearance, and in the Netflix documentary, Anthony's mother, who was her boyfriend, didn't feel capable of giving such news to the girl's mother. She gave the family's phone to the police, who committed to calling and notifying about Mallory's disappearance. However, they didn't call, and the girl's family found out what happened to her from strangers at 5 in the morning. Mallory's body was only found a few days later by a stranger, while the rescue did such an unmotivated job that the city's residents had the clear impression that they didn't want to find the girl. Therefore, if the body wasn't found, there was no body, and there being no homicide, Paul couldn't be taken to a jury trial for driving drunk. And the fact, followers, is that Mallory's family always tried to approach the crime scene, but were always prevented under the allegation that it was a crime scene. However, the Murdaugh family always had free access to the location without any type of police interference, even though this location was a crime scene. Followers, I don't like to express any kind of opinion in my videos, but I'm feeling so irritated with this content. What? Am I going to have to say something? I believe I had never seen this before. I think not even in Brazilian cases, as I usually bring here from time to time. The fact of the police uniting with Paul's family, who was directly responsible for this tragedy, and wanting to save this kid's face, wanting to blame Connor, who had nothing to do with it, who on the contrary wanted to prevent the worst from happening, and leaving the victim's family, Mallory, without news of her and preventing them from going to the location to investigate the case. To me, it's quite revolting. That is, the local police, they worried much more about saving the criminal's face, the offenders, than finding the victim who had already even lost her life. This, followers, shocked me greatly. Okay, I leave my statement here. But continuing, Morgan made her statements and things started to get bad for Paul. According to Morgan, Paul had already been involved in another accident before when he was driving a pickup truck drunk and the vehicle got stuck in a ditch. When this happened, she picked up the phone and tried to call 911, but Paul took her cell phone and threw it away, calling his family members right after. They appeared in force at the scene and started taking out of the pickup truck everything that was compromising, and the police shouldn't find, like beer bottles, for example.
With Mallory lifeless, the Murdaugh family once again was in the spotlight of a criminal case that didn't end well. And Paul also wasn't arrested, despite being primarily responsible for what happened. The fact, followers, is that Paul was indeed pointed out as directly responsible for Mallory's death, but a bail of $50,000 was stipulated for Paul to answer the process in freedom. And this amount, followers, was a tip for the Murdaugh family. However, this didn't come cheap for them, since the community was outraged by the situation. And in this way, Paul started receiving anonymous threats from the local population. But in life, everything has its price. Paul got out of jail, yes, but he no longer had friends. Morgan reached the limit of her relationship with him, and she told about the abusive relationship she suffered during the 4 years of living with Paul. She came to believe that Mallory gave her life to save hers, because it was after this accident that Morgan put an end to her relationship with Paul. With this, followers, Paul ended up isolating himself and going to live in one of the family's houses. It was a hunting cabin with a kennel of dogs, trained to help the Murdaugh family members hunt. There were all types of hunting weapons that the Murdaugh family could have. Despite being isolated, Paul felt safe because he mastered hunting techniques, and moreover, he had good handling of the weapons existing there, and the cabin was inside the Murdaugh property. Well, followers, time passed, and June 7th, 2021 arrived. And on that date at night, in that same cabin where Paul was living, he and his mother Maggie were found lifeless, as I'll tell now. The bodies of Maggie and Paul were found by Alex, who claimed to have gone to visit his parents that night due to his mother's mental health problems. And when he returned home, he saw the scene of carnage in Paul's cabin. And to make it even worse, Alex's father, Randolph Murdaugh III, lost his life at 81 years of age 3 days later. In an interview with a newspaper, Alex's brothers stated that Paul had received anonymous threats since the time of the boat accident. The local police searched for suspects, which would be Anthony Cook, Mallory's boyfriend. However, he had such a good alibi that it became impossible to place him at the crime scene. 3 months later, Alex was shot in the head while changing his car's tire on a highway, but he survived. Well, followers, to what extent can we consider this attack as true? Considering the fact that even shot in the head, Alex called emergency asking for help and telling what happened to him. In testimony, Alex claimed he didn't have the courage to shoot himself in the head and that he asked his trusted drug dealer to do it for him, but the shot grazed him and he called the ambulance. The drug dealer was called to clarify facts at the police station and denied Alex's story, claiming that if he had done this, Alex would be dead, and that Alex alive was proof that he, the drug dealer, had nothing to do with the case. Alex was accused of improperly pocketing over $1 million from clients over the years. The money disappeared, and when confronted by his partners, Alex confessed days before the alleged attack he suffered. And right after, the South Carolina Bar Association suspended Alex's license. And to worsen his situation, those who helped him before, in Paul's case, in the boat accident, realized that now the Murdaugh situation was more delicate, and started doing their jobs according to the rigors of the law. And so circumstantial evidence emerged that he was at the crime scene when Maggie and Paul lost their lives. In this way, all other accusations came to the surface against him as well. The fraud, the fake homicide, the manipulation of the boat case, and the cases of the homicides of Gloria Satterfield and Stephen Smith. In this way, Alex went to jury trial. So Alex's trial began, and a big question mark hung in the air. What reason would Alex Murdaugh have to take his wife's and son's lives so brutally? And in a trial that lasted 6 weeks, the truth began to appear. Alex's brother John Marvin spoke emotionally about how he found the crime scene after the police released his entry into the cabin. To get an idea of the brutality of the crime, Maggie was hit by 5 rifle shots, and Paul took 2 shotgun blasts with such violence that his brain was completely separated from his head. Throughout the trial, Alex maintained his innocence from beginning to end, and the prosecution maintained the line of reasoning that Alex killed his wife and son to escape the financial crimes he was being accused of, especially because if he were arrested for fraud, the family would also collapse. Followers, even with such fragile evidence, Alex was convicted, and I'm going to explain to you now why. The evidence was indeed quite fragile, but there were several accusations involving Alex's name and the Murdaugh family. There were inconsistencies in Alex's testimony when he said he wasn't at the crime scene at the time everything happened, when in fact he was. People who were longtime friends of Alex testified against him at the trial.
And the jury took only 3 hours to deliberate Alex's sentence for the deaths of his wife and son. And this sentence, followers, was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Buster, Alex's surviving son, was the only witness who spoke in favor of his father at the trial. Buster stayed until the end of the sentence in the courtroom and heard his father say to him in a murmur the following: "I'm sorry, son. I love you." And now, followers, it's time for our discussion. So let's go to today's questions. Number 1. Do you believe Alex is innocent or guilty of the crimes against Maggie and Paul? Number 2. Do you believe Buster didn't testify against Alex out of love for his father or out of fear? Yes or no? Why? Leave your opinions in the comments and let's interact, because what's good for you, followers, will be good for me too.